early church Jewish Christian writer called Hegesippus in the 2nd century, who has the recording of the death of James, and in it he gives this "Oh, just one," always in place of his very name. The crowd at Passover or Sukkot, whenever it is, when he's thrown down, supposedly. Well, anyway, wherever you see the righteous here, it's the righteous teacher. So that's where I got the idea from these classes. James, who we go through, Jacob the Tzaddik, James is a righteous teacher type. In the Greek New Testament, those who don't know these combinations, James in English is Jacobus in Greek, Jacob in Hebrew. So, well, why do they call him James? I suppose it went from Latin into Spanish, became Jaime somehow, and then somehow it got to England and became James. I don't know how it got to be James, but that's how everyone knows this person. But in English, in England even, normally if a guy's called James, they often call him Jack. Sometimes they call it John Jack, sometimes they call it James Jack, you know, from Jacobus. I mean, Jack is just a shortening in English of Jacobus. But anyway, we'll leave it at that. So that's so important, first column. And where we see wicked, it's usually the wicked priest. Now the wicked priest is certainly an adversary of the righteous teacher, but as I've told you over and over again, he is not the spouter of lies that we encountered in the Damascus document. We will encounter the spouter of lies again in the Habakkuk commentary here. He's the wicked priest as this devolves, and we have the information here, is the person responsible for the destruction of the righteous teacher. And we know the righteous teacher is destroyed from this document and from the Psalm 37 pesher or commentary. What do you mean Psalm 37? There's a commentary on Psalm 37, or a pesher. And once again, it's a tzaddik text. This is a tzaddik text. I think they chose their text if they had the word tzaddik in it. That's how they chose what text they were going to subject to this peculiar exegesis. It had to have that word in it so they could develop these exegesis. Okay, so let's look at this. The wicked encompasses the righteous. That's perfect. So even though it's fragmentary, we know that the line 11 has to do with the righteous teacher, and so we assume the rest is the wicked priest is, has to do with their confrontation or destruction or something of the righteous teacher. Now column 2 is less fragmentary because it's further into the document. So its interpretation, something about there'll be wonders, you'll be astonished, and judgment will go forth. Notice how the judgment will be repeated at the end of this document. Judgment will go forth as the last judgment. And it says last judgment. It says last judgment. Last judgment is not something we ordinarily associate with Judaism, because the Christians have basically taken it over. But you see in the 1st century, it's very, very Jewish. Most extreme zealot Jewishness in these documents. Okay. So right away, there's visions about the last days we've heard about in the Damascus document. That puts the Habakkuk commentary and the Damascus document in the same period. Why? If you think that the Damascus document is written in the 2nd century BC, as many scholars in this field do, and you think the Habakkuk commentary and the Psalm 37 commentary are in the 1st century AD, then you're talking about almost 3 centuries between them. It's like looking at events that were happening in Newton's time or Washington's time, and speaking about the same events a couple of 200 or 300 years later. I think that's not possible. And I think that shows that the establishment theory are just way out in space. All these so-called sectarian documents that people never saw before, not the biblical context and things that we know about, like Enoch and different documents like that, all these sectarian things we never saw before are probably written around the same time. Doesn't mean they're written on the same day, but in the same, more or less the same period. And we even have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, unpublished from Cave 4, manuscripts which show the community rule is tacked on to the Damascus document or vice versa. They more or less continue from each other. And so how did they get this dating, the official theory or consensus? From the handwriting, as I told you. And I told you these were like, they would put all these pieces in piles, and then they'd get familiar with the handwriting, and then they would count characteristics in the style that looked like an old document that they may have known from Egypt called the Nash Papyrus in the 3rd century BC, and then they would compare it with Bar Kokhba letters that are dated in the 2nd century AD, and they'd say, oh, a lot of characteristics look like that, and a lot of characteristics look like that, and then they would line them up in a straight line, and that's how they would get their graph of the handwriting. And then they would say, like in the Damascus document, there may be 9 more modern looking script types to them and 1 old one. They say, oh, the old one is the one that dates it, so that looks old, so that must be 2nd century BC, so the Damascus document must be 2nd century BC. Well, that's the thinking of a school child, of a baby young.
Does it really matter? Isn't it irrelevant if they're using it in the time?
No, it is. It does matter because, you know, they try to put Habakkuk back too.
Yeah.
Well, okay, you can be using it. Yeah, you can be using it. That's a possibility. But the critique that I'm trying to develop here is that all these documents that refer to a righteous teacher, a spouter of lies, you wouldn't have people writing in the 1st century the same way they're writing 3 centuries before, it seems to me. I mean, if I'm going to write about George Bush as a liar, you know, and I have a code to write about him as a liar that people do today, you know, this is not George Washington's time. So I think you do have to focus it on a time. I think maybe it doesn't matter in terms of how you interpret it, but I think it really does matter because the liar is mentioned in the Damascus document. So, you know, you want to put him back in the 2nd century BC? I don't think that you can, and I don't think you should. But that's, you know, there. You say, well, how come they do that? Because I don't think they read the text like this with their students. You know, and plus you have the lemming effect I've told you about. Graduate students at Harvard and Oxford and places like that tend to follow their professors implicitly because they're afraid of incurring the unhappiness or wrath, if you like, of that particular professor. You wouldn't want to be in one of Strugnell's classes, who just died last week. Had a bit in the New York Times this weekend of him. You wouldn't want to be in one of his classes and disagree with him, I can assure you. You know, that's what professors